And I'll also send the link for our core accounting. And we thank you for joining us for a few minutes today on your Wednesday. Just make sure that you can hear me. I am chatting. Hopefully you're having a lovely Wednesday afternoon. Some of you in the South, the schools are already out, but those of us up in the North, there's no school today. So hopefully you're still having a good day. All right, I'm going to get started on the intro slides as everyone else comes in. Just to remind you, we are ICS, or Innovative Cloud Solutions. We were established in 1996. We have offices in Buffalo, Richmond, and Orlando. We rep 3 different ERP packages. So in addition to Microsoft Dynamics GP, which hopefully you're all aware of, we also rep Microsoft Dynamics Business Central, so Microsoft's cloud package, their basic one, and Acumatica, which is another ERP that is also cloud-based. I am your host today. I'm Devon Southall. I'm a GP consultant. Over 18 years of GP experience, and I work out of our North office, so I'm in Buffalo, New York. I have a background in accounting and small business, and I mostly specialize in distribution and manufacturing, which is why I'm not your presenter today, but I am being your host. Today we are going to talk about backup and server maintenance. So this is our June Quick Bite webinar. We're going to take July off and then, oh, actually, no, we have a presentation in July and I think we're taking August. There's a schedule. I shouldn't ad-lib these things. All right, your presentation today is going to be Chris Caslow. So Chris is our GP support manager. He has over 23 years at ICS South. Hi, Chris. He is a Dynamics GP admin. He focuses on GP upgrades and support, and he jokingly says he's a jack of all trades but master of none. He's good at getting answers to problems, whatever your problems may be. So Chris will be doing the bulk of the presentation today. And before we get into the actual presentation, we always want to talk about GP's future, because I'm sure everyone has heard noise from the world about GP. The reality is self-hosted ERPs are on their way out. Software manufacturers are trying to get rid of them. They would love what I jokingly call that sweet, sweet monthly revenue of subscription-based ERPs. That's just the way of the world. What we know from Microsoft is that they're going to provide 3 releases per year, at least through 2028. Beyond that, they've made no guarantees. And my bet is there's going to be at least a few more years after that, because the instant they stop releasing that, there's no reason for you to continue to give them what subscription money you give them. So beyond that, we don't know. ICS as a team is committed to supporting GP for years to come. I mean, I have 18 years, Chris has 23 years. This is the software we know, although our company is working on other ERPs and team members are moving around. I have experience in Acumatica. Also, GP is my bread and butter. And so our theory is, let's make GP work best for you so that you can continue to support it as long as you choose to use it. And really, that's our perspective on GP, but it's not going away and we're not going away. So that's our GP. So I'm going to kick it off to Chris, and he's going to talk about supporting the GP you have for the SQL Server and the server maintenance. All right, so take it away, Chris.
Awesome. Thank you, Devon. Good afternoon, everybody. See, I leave all the this tough stuff to Devon and her team and the consulting, so I just get out here and get things done. So thanks, everybody, for joining me. Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you. So a lot of the stuff we're going to be talking about today is going to be containing to the SQL Server. You'll hear me say SSMS, which is SQL Server Management Studio. Just because if you're in accounting on this, you don't have to go to sleep or roll back. We really want you to work closely with your IT department and have that relationship so you understand how important these things are we're going to talk about. Backups are one of the most important things you can do. We back up other things, right? You back up your phones, you back up these things. So we want to make sure that you're backing up your GP properly. You'll hear a little story later about the horrors or disasters that can happen when you don't have good backups. So with that said, want to talk about some of the things that should be running all the time on the SQL Server. You can see this slide here. When you open SSMS or Management Studio, there's that little yellow thing on the bottom. It's called the SQL Server agent, right? So if that does not have a green arrow on it, that means that service is not running. If that service is not running, right, what we're talking about, the backups will not go off. So you will not get your nightly backups that we're talking about. So that's one of the first things when you see a backup failed, you're going to want to check these services. Okay, so we got to make sure that service is running all the time. Go ahead, next slide there, Devon. So if that service is not running, you can go in and hit Start Services and go to SQL Server Agent. It's that little agent down there in the middle. I'm using SQL 2019 for this. And you can hit the Start button if it's not able. If you get errors when it's not able to log in, then you've got to look for some IT or network related issues at why that service is not running. That can be run under a domain admin, but most of the time it's run under local services. Okay. We also like to use the startup type as delayed start because when the SQL Server gets rebooted, right, we'll let that SQL Server Windows OS have all their pieces up and running. They get that OS up and running, and then you've got a delayed start on the SQL Server agent. I believe it's anywhere between 30 and 45 seconds after that Windows completely gets booted back up. Okay, next. All right, let's talk about the recovery models that we use for database backups. As you can see there, I've got a couple databases in there. Dynamics is an important one, and a two database. The two database in this instance would be like your company database, whatever that company database is. So let's talk about the full recovery model. Okay, what the full recovery model does is allows you a complete backup. We're going to run that. Normally we run it at 10 o'clock at night, right? That means most people are going to be out of GP at that time, not working. You can run it anytime you want. You need to take that into consideration. But that also allows you to do transaction log backups. That is a point where it gives you a point in time recovery when you have transaction logs. So for an example, let's say at 1 in the afternoon, you realize that you've done something bad and deleted a bunch of records, right? You can get a hold of us or IT and say, hey, I've messed up and I want to go back to 12 noon and restore that back up. Full recovery mode allows you to do that if you have your transaction logs and those backups are being made, the transaction logs, okay? A simple backup recovery mode is you're getting a full backup when you say you want to do it. So you're going to have a 10 p.m. backup. It's simple. There are no logs. There's no transactions being ran. So a lot of people choose this maybe because of space, but maybe they're not concerned so much. As long as they've got a good backup to roll back to the previous night, that's okay with them. Okay. So those are really the two models we use. There are other models. I think it's backlog. It's not on the Microsoft recommended, at least Microsoft GP recommended, so we don't use those backup recovery models. Okay, next. All right, I'm just going to quickly talk about what a maintenance plan looks like. If you were to go into SSMS down here and look down at management, you're going to see a maintenance plan folder. Okay, so what I would normally do is I would right click on that and I would create a wizard, right? I would name that GP daily backup. And then I would change on the bottom the schedule. Okay. So what's important is you got to figure out, like I said, when you want these backups to go off. Maybe it's 10 p.m., maybe it's 9 p.m., whatever you want. If you have a large databases and it might take them 30, 45 minutes to back up, you would want to consider that. But usually we're starting these full backups at night. Okay. When do you want to do it? That's the big question. All right. So now here's the most important part. You've got to choose which databases are critical to your organization. For example, right, you really need the Dynamics database because that is the system database for all of your GP companies. That handles your user security. It handles how those companies interact with which users have access to those companies. So that's, you got to have a Dynamics database backup. You got to have your company database backups, right? Whatever companies you feel are your main companies, you can back those up. I don't necessarily back up the test companies, right? Because a test company might be a full size, it's going to be the same size as your live company. So if you got a 100 gig live company, and you back up a test company that's 200 gigs, you might want to use your space more wisely than that. So I don't necessarily back up test companies unless I'm in the middle of a project and we want to keep fresh backups of those. Okay. Some other ones are management reporter. You want to make sure you have a management reporter backup. You do not need to back up the management reporter data mart, because that data mart can get deleted any time if we go rebuild a data mart. It's kind of just a housing facility for the transactions that come through the company into the management reporter. The management reporter database holds all your rows, columns, and trees. It holds that report structure, so you definitely want to have that. Smart Connect might be one if you're doing integrations. Report server. If you've got customized SSRS reports, you're going to definitely want to back up the report server database as well on a nightly basis. And then if you've got third-party products, I'll use an example of PaperSafe. If anybody's familiar with that, sometimes people have other databases on that SQL server that you can add to this backup plan if needed. But that's a choice you need to make, and you need to make sure you get those backups of the companies that you want to make sure you have if something happens. All right, next. All right, important other topic is, where do we want these backups to go? So when you're building this, if the destination is, in this instance, I have it go on my C drive because I don't have multiple drives. But most of the time on a SQL server, right, there's a C drive for overhead, and then there's a D or an E for the SQL databases, things like that. So it's okay to put those on that local drive, right? If you have enough disk space and you have that, it's okay to put those databases there. But, and we'll get to this in a second why it's important, you're going to want to move those off at some point and not keep them on that live server all the time, right? We're going to keep 5 days maybe, but we want to actually pull some of those off nightly or wherever onto a different server. And again, we'll talk about why that's important in a second. I always like to create a subdirectory for each database because it actually makes it more manageable for me to look in that customer's folder and say, hey, it creates a folder that's the name of the database. So Dynamics has its own folder. The Dynamics databases are in there. 2 has a folder. 2 has the databases in there. And this is what it looks like, right? If I'm pushing these backups to here, you've got the Dynamics report server 2. And then if I were to log into that Dynamics database folder, I see a timestamp of when that backup went off, and it tells me what the size is, so I can help manage what the size of that D drive or C drive looks like, for IT related process. Okay, so you see, I got a timestamp, I've got the date, I've got the time it went off. Let's go to one that has a transaction log, Devon. I think it's next slide. All right, so when you're doing a full transaction log, you have a full database backup and you've got a transaction log. Now, in this instance, I've got it set to where those transaction logs are going off every hour. You could set this for every 15 minutes. You could set it for every 2 hours. It doesn't matter. But going back to what I was saying, let's say I had a crash at 1 o'clock, okay? And you are a customer who's not just doing a simple, you're doing a full backup with transaction logs. We could go into the hour, we're going to restore the full backup, and then I could take you back to noon on the transaction log, and you would be, 15 minutes, an hour before when that tragedy, whatever we call it, happened, to where you're not losing a full days of work. Okay, make sense? Anybody have any questions on that real quick?
So feel free to use the question area, and I've actually restored backups back to like the minute before it crashed.
Right. So,
yeah.
So the transaction logs and the full backup allow you to do that, to restore a point in time. All right.
I
No
don't see
questions.
any
We'll move
questions
on.
at this point.
Okay.
No one's raised their hand that they're trying. So
Awesome. All right, let's move on, Devin. Next. Okay. All right. So same kind of thing with the cleanup process, right? If we don't have a cleanup process for our backups, then those backups will just keep running and running until your server runs out of space, and that would be a bad thing, right? That's when servers crash. That's why we have to have a cleanup, a maintenance plan to clean up, delete old backups. All right. What we normally do, you can do it any way you want to, depending on the size of space you have on the servers or where you push that backup to a different server, right? But you got to consider how large your databases are and what that looks like. So I'm going to make that path the exact same path as where the backups are going. I'm going to make sure I include the first level subfolders checkbox, and then see down below it's going to say, hey, I want to delete backups on every 5 days. On the 5th day, when that 6th day backup goes off at night at 10 p.m., the one 6 days earlier gets deleted off. So I'm only keeping the last 5 days. Now, that can be 3 days, it can be 2 days. The only reason, and this is my example of why I like 5 days, is because if you're not working on the weekends, let's say, and you still have a backup going off every night, let's say you did something on Thursday, and then you came in on Tuesday and realized, gosh, I messed something up last Friday. It allows me 5 days to get back to that backup or a good clean backup. It gives me a little longer to get back to a good clean backup, instead of being rushed with 3 days. Because if I come in on Monday and only got 3 days, that backup for Friday's gone, right? So that's why I like to put a little leeway in there. But of course, it all depends on what kind of space we've got and where we're keeping those backups. All right, next. So another cool thing is, right, it's going to create a log automatically every time you do a backup. And it's going to go generally to that same SQL Server backup location. There's going to be a text file that gets created that says, hey, this backup was successful or not. Something else we can do, right, if you turn on or set up SQL database mail, you have that little checkbox email report. You can create a report. That report's going to automatically get emailed when that backup gets finished to somebody, right? Whether in IT, whether in accounting, whoever wants to know that, hey, I want to know every morning when I come in that my backups are successful. So you can, if you set up SQL database mail, if you don't know how to do that, we can help you do that. But you can set that up to where if that report gets assigned into somebody's mailbox every morning. We have also in the past set up scheduled jobs that when that thing fails, if that backup fails, then somebody automatically gets an email when that backup fails. So when they come in the morning, they say, I got an email. It said that the backups failed. We need to hop on there and find out what's going on, right? We want to make sure that we understand that's what's taking place, and we got to go fix that before the next night backup goes off, because it might be disk space related. That's one reason why backups might fail. If it ran out of space, it didn't have space, it's going to crash, right? So we want to make sure we're on top of that game and realize that these are the things that can take place. All right, next. All right, this is something we like to do. It's called a GP weekly maintenance plan. It's a separate maintenance plan um, from your backups, right? So I usually run this weekly, and you can choose the time you want to run this. It can be 4 o'clock, but usually we're running on Sunday because there's not generally a lot of people working on Sunday. It's a pretty low minimal usage maintenance plan. But as you see, I've got mine going off at Sunday nights at 7 p.m. So every Sunday at 7 p.m., there's going to be these 3 things that get done, and these are Microsoft recommendations. You can move the next slide down. And basically what we're doing is we're checking database integrity, right? We're reorganizing indexes, and we're updating statistics. So these are all recommendations by Microsoft to do. There's a couple of things you don't want to do with GP databases. You never want to shrink a GP database unless we've got some issues where we need to shrink it, okay? Because that shrinking GP databases sometimes has an adverse effect on where things lie. So we don't ever make that as part of our maintenance plan. We usually just check the database, we reorganize the indexes, and then we update statistics. And on the left there, you can see kind of what those 3 things are doing. It actually tells you when you highlight one of those, what it's actually going to perform for you down below. All right. Next. All right, so this is what this looks like when it's all done in your management studio. Okay, we've got a maintenance plan, and now we have 3 jobs going off. Basically, we've got a daily backup, 10 p.m. We've got transaction logs going off every hour. At least that's the way mine's set up. And then we've got a GP maintenance. So as long as that SQL Server agent is running, every night those jobs should run and create a log for each one of those in, in that log file folder. And if not, we can also have an email going in that structure. Any questions on backup maintenance plans? Straightforward, right? All right, let's get up to some other fun stuff. So in the north and in the south, because when we came together, they might have been different versions, but there's definitely other folders in your GP environment that we want to make sure we have backups of. In the south, we use something called GP Share. This was always a shared folder that housed, and it's usually housed on the SQL Server, unless IT wants us to put it somewhere else. But it's a shared folder on the SQL Server that has install files of your current install. It's got modified reports dictionaries. As you see, I've got a folder over there called reports. It has integration files or integration templates for either Smart Connect, things like that. So these are things that people use on a daily basis that are pretty critical to if something were to happen as far as a disaster recovery thing. So if you have a lot of modified reports and and everybody in your division is using a modified report and they're using that modified report, even as simple as a check format, right? It might take, if you have a complicated check format, a payable check format, and you lost that check format, it might take us a half a day to go rebuild that check format. If you have a copy somewhere else of that check modified report in one of these folders off-site, then we can get that and get you back up and running very quickly without having to go remake that modified form from scratch. Does that make sense? So we're keeping modified reports. If you have smart Excel sheets, if you've got custom SSRS reports, most all the time they're going to be held in one of these folders out in the GP Share or the MS Dynamics GP folder share format. Okay. So the reason why I'm saying we want to be able to take this off nightly too, this GP Share folder, pull it off nightly somewhere else onto another server, like those backups, so we have access to them in case something happens. All right. So let's talk about kind of the difference between a .bak, which is a SQL backup file, and then virtualization backups, or when IT says, hey, we're making snapshots of the server. Great, we should be making snapshots of the server, right? These are for mission critical events that happen, and we have this is all encompassing of a disaster recovery plan. So you want to think about this. So yes, we have server backups, we have server snapshots. So if something happened, right, and the server gets hacked or the building burns down, are we able to get that snapshot back up and onto a new server quickly, right? So accounting can get their work done. These things need to be practiced and thought about at least once a year. Okay. Here's the horror story, right? I just had it wasn't my customer, it was somebody who came to me. We have a customer that came to us and said, hey, we got ransomware back in the fall of 2023. And when the IT partner came back to them, they said, hey, they got it intrusive on all their servers and it took out all the servers. They asked them, hey, do we have any backups to restore from? And they did not have any backups. They had no virtualization. They had to go back to an old 26 GP server and re-upgrade that. And the last backup they had was April of 2022. Okay. So they had to restore that back up to April 2022 on new servers, re-upgrade them, and then start live work from January of 2024. So right now they're missing data between April 2022 and January of 2024. And we're working to try to put together a plan to do that. So that's a real life story. And we've seen this probably 6 to 12 times over the last 4 or 5 years. People calling us and saying, hey, I got ransomed, I got hacked, and even the virtualization didn't work, right? They didn't have a good way because it took all those servers and they had to take all those servers offline. I'm just telling you, with a good backup, if you've got a good backup, whether I had any of this or not, a good backup of the Dynamics database, a good backup, a recent backup, I'm talking about within a day, it could even be within a week, of the company databases. If I had the GP share folder and the building and the server burned down, and I had those backups somewhere, we could spin up a new server, install SQL Maintenance Studios, restore those backups, install GP, probably less than a half a day, and you would have your data right there. So that's the really important part about for me, .BAKs are everything, because I know without a shadow of a doubt that I can get somebody up and running if I have a good, clean .BAK file, right? It doesn't even have to be a transaction file, because at that point, you're just trying to get one good full backup from somewhere so you can get back to work. So these are real life stories that happen, but I know every time uh, that I could get somebody up and running if we've got good, clean backups. Even if I didn't have this GP share folder, we could recreate the reports dictionaries, but I know we could get your data back to where that last .BAK came from. So very important to think about that and focus on that when you do a disaster recovery plan. I believe a disaster recovery plan should be, you should test that once a year, right? If you're taking snapshots, you should take a snapshot and restore that somewhere. I don't know how, I'm not a network guy, but you can restore it somewhere and have users actually log in there and verify it's working. I know backups work because I'm restoring backups from live companies every day to test companies, and that test company will look exactly the same from when I took that backup. So I know that works every time. I'm not a network guy. I don't know about the virtualization and snapshots. I've heard horror stories of that sometimes, where I had a backup plan. I did a snapshot, which is great. You got them. It didn't work when I tried to mount that backup plan to a new server. So just FYI, these things need to be talked about between accounting and IT to make sure we have the proper plan. All right.
Yeah, and just to chime in with
Anybody?
Chris on that,
Yeah.
we have at least one or two customers a year that are hacked, virused, or ransomwared, and
Yeah.
it's always a thing. And most of the time, it's the off-site tape backups that save the day. Um,
Correct.
in addition to that, those BAKs are super helpful from an accounting standpoint. Yeah, we're not going to roll back, but somebody mistakenly updated all your vendors roll down by accident from a vendor class. We can restore that BAK into a test company and then help just fix that one piece of data. So
Correct.
we are strongly on the BAK bandwagon.
Right.
All right, giving it
Please.
back to Chris and moving to the next slide.
Move on. All right, we've been pretty heavy on the backup piece, right? I hope we drove that home enough. But there are some other things that you can do on the GP server recommendations. One of the big ones we get a lot is, things are dragging, it's a little slow. SQL Server is a RAM or a memory hog. Okay, we all know this. It's okay to limit, and let's say you have 64 gig of RAM. It's okay to hold 4 gig of RAM out for operating system overhead, like the stuff that runs on the C drive, the Windows. That's okay. But we really don't want to limit RAM on a GP SQL server. The reason for this is SQL is designed to take as much memory as it needs for that process, and then it comes back down. So let's say for month end, you're running a lot of trial balance reports, or SQL reports, or whatever, management report reports. You want somebody's running that big report. You want that memory to go get tapped out. You want it to use as much as can. You don't want to cap it off. You want to let it use as much memory as it can, and then once that report's finished, it goes back down. We hear a lot of that at month end, right, year end, where people are running lots of reports. If it's deadly slow, one of the first things we say is you might need to add more RAM. Maybe if you've got 12 users in and you've only got 32 gig of RAM on the SQL server, that's probably not enough RAM for a GP instance of SQL, because Management Reporter alone, if you're using Management Reporter, the minimum is 32 gig RAM just to run Management Report or Data Mart. So that's not counting all the other reports in GP or 12 users in the system, whatever that is. So if you think you're getting some slow, one of the first things I always suggest, how much RAM is on that server? Do we need to add more RAM, and let that try for a while, right? So don't limit that RAM. Let it be. If it's 64, you can make it 60 for overhead, but let it use all that RAM you want. We've definitely got to maintain our Windows update, the Windows update reports. And this is probably a good time for monthly, because we recommend that you reboot your SQL Server monthly. So in that instance, what that does is actually cleans out some temp tables and things that get, I use the word geezed. They're just kind of in there. Maybe some users are stuck. They didn't log out properly. Maybe they were in a transaction and went off to lunch, and GP didn't come back up. So they've left a stray transaction out there. When you reboot that SQL Server monthly, you can do it weekly, but monthly is general knowledge on what you're doing. Some people have to reboot it weekly because they're doing large processes with other things. So we tell them to do that. But monthly's fine. If you're a small shop, you want to do it every 3 months, that's okay too. If you start seeing some things that are not running as fast, then you can do it monthly. So you might as well do your Windows updates monthly, reboot the SQL Server monthly, right? A couple things that we recommend is don't reboot it during the day when the users are in. We definitely don't want to do that, because that causes transaction possibly loss. So when users are in the GP and they're posting a batch, you reboot the server, things get stuck, right? I know some of you all have called me about stuck batches, right? When GP is crashed or something like that. That's kind of what happens. There could be possible data loss when you're rebooting while people are still in. So we got to log the users out cleanly. If the users aren't logged out cleanly before you reboot, you can run a SQL script that says, hey, select from activity or the SY800 table, and that's going to show you who's still in. It's going to give you a timestamp of who's still in, and also anybody who has Windows open in that. So we can give you a script. We call it the hammer, right? It takes people out manually from the SQL Server. It wipes people out of there. It cleans up transactions that are stuck and gives you a clean slate. So you can run that before you reboot the server, or you can run it after you reboot the server. But when you reboot that server, remember, you've got to go back in and make sure that SQL Server agent is running and all of your services are running properly in order for that backup plan to start taking a hold again. All right. Okay, let's talk about recap real quick. Whew, hope you all stayed with me. I'm running out of breath there. So we got to make sure the services are running, right? And then if you do not have a disaster recovery plan or a backup plan, or you don't even know if you do or not, you want to put some thought into what that looks like. Whether you're okay with going back to last night's backup with just a simple, or you would want it in a point in time full transaction log backup. When they go off, where you're going to keep them. Like I say, I've got people who keep them on totally separate servers in case this server gets hacked or burns down or whatever it is. They've got those BAKs on a different server, right? And you want to keep that along with your GP share folder at minimum, or any other critical integration pieces that you have, right? The decision on how long to keep them is your plan. I have some customers who every month when they do their month end close, they keep at least a monthly backup out there, right? So they can at least get back to a previous month, off site somewhere else. When you think about nowadays, because data is fairly cheap, I pay I think it's $10 a month for 2 terabyte storage on a Google Drive. So if your backups are kind of small, you can push those up to a Google Drive that you have, and you would have some of those backups for a pretty long time. If your database backups were only a gig a piece, it would take a long time to fill up that 2 terabyte. And then every year you can reassess how many backups you want to keep, right? But a disaster recovery plan is a must. We got to know where those backups are, because like I said, sometimes those snapshots might not work. You have to test those snapshots. We got to make sure they're working. But I know every time, if I've got a good clean backup, like I said, I can get somebody up and running back on GP. Other server maintenance, just normal, making sure your Windows updates are good, and you should be all set. Hope that helps. Time for the big questions.